We'll just trim off the fat at the beginning. Is that the?
I think that's the idea.
Okay, cool.
The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, featuring your host, Gabe and Ken.
Welcome to the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. I'm Gabe Reineck, and this is Ken Holyoke. So the goal here is that we're going to spend the next year fortnightly explaining New Brunswick archaeology to you within our limited capacity to do so. And so what we're going to do this episode is talk a little bit about each other, which is something we know a lot about. And we're hoping to try to enlist you to trust us here as we talk about New Brunswick archaeology. But before we do that, we were going to start off by, we don't have the rights to any intro music. We know that's hard to believe for a high budget operation that you can already tell this is.
Yeah.
So we were going to tell you what sound music we would have once we finally get the exciting special men's underwear and energy drink podcast sponsors. So Ken, if we were going to start off on this with some music, what would have been playing?
I think the Log Drivers Waltz would be a good intro to New Brunswick archaeology. You know, tied in with some heritage minutes.
Oh wow, okay, that's subtle. That's I was just gonna suspect. I thought you were gonna say "Digging a Hole" by Big Sugar.
Oh, that would be a good one actually. That would
Not
be
a
good.
bad one. Yeah, I thought maybe "Digging in the Dirt" by Peter Gabriel would be where to start.
Yeah.
So we'll give the listener a second to meditate on that thought, and they can pick whichever one they want. So
I mean, now that I'm here, I guess it could be All Hell for a Basement in the heaven in Alberta.
Yeah, exactly. And so you mentioned Alberta. This is a New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, and you're in Alberta. So tell us about yourself, Ken. You work at University of Lethbridge.
Yep. So I'm an assistant professor at the University of Lethbridge. I'm in the Department of Geography and Environment, and we're home to 3 archaeologists in our geography department and another one in the anthropology department. And I started there in July. I'm finishing my PhD at the University of Toronto and did my master's at UNB in Fredericton. Same with my undergrad. This is where I met the illustrious Dr. Reineck during our master's degree at the University of New Brunswick. And I've been working in New Brunswick archaeology really since 2008, in the field at least. So started in CRM at that time at the end of my undergrad, and worked professionally between 2012 and 2017 when I went back to school.
Great. So what's CRM? We'll walk you back for just a second.
Oh yeah,
We don't lose the
listeners here.
Yeah, exactly.
Cultural resource management, so impact assessment archaeology, and so. If you're working professionally in archaeology in North America, something like 90 to 95% of people who are employed in full-time equivalent positions would probably be employed in CRM industry. So you might be working as a private consultant for a small independent company. So you might own your own company, or a multi-service firm. So maybe a large environmental consulting firm. You might be working for a government branch who either regulates or participates in the CRM industry. You might be working for a university who has a CRM company or has some CRM affiliation, or government agencies like Parks Canada or the National Park Service in the States. Fantastic.
And if I'm remembering correctly, Ken, you've worked for actually all of those groups you just mentioned in your career.
A few, yes.
Yeah.
So,
but you've worked for private consulting firms here in New Brunswick, and you worked for parks in New Brunswick too, if I'm remembering correctly.
We were contracted for parks in Atlantic Canada when I worked in private consulting, but I worked for parks in Southern Ontario at the Rouge National Urban Park. That's where I was based out of. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
And a little stint in BC for some CRM, but most of it in the Maritimes in Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, great. Which is where you're from too. You're a legit New Brunswicker.
Legit New Brunswicker. Yeah.
Yeah. The listener won't be able to. The astute listener will already pick that up from your voice.
Yeah, the hard R's still come through.
Yeah, this is how they're going to tell us apart. They're going to recognize that. Well, the one that sounds like he's actually from New Brunswick, and then there's the one with the high lispy New England accent. which makes me the interloper, even though I'm in New Brunswick now. So I'm Gabe Reineck, and I'm a associate professor at the University of New Brunswick, which, like Ken said, is where I did my master's degree, and then the rest of graduate school at the University of Connecticut, and then came back here. And in addition to Ken being a more legitimate New Brunswicker than me, most of my research has actually lately been in Maine. But I've also worked in cultural resource management in New Brunswick, as well as in
Maine.
Maine, yeah, and other parts of New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and I've done some research in Nova Scotia as well. So our interest, though, I think, in New Brunswick archaeology. So if this might be something that would be useful to kind of chase out, because I think it might illustrate some things about New Brunswick archaeology. So why are you interested in New Brunswick archaeology, Ken, or about the region in general?
Basically, I mean, I grew up there. Most of my work has been along the Wolastoq River, the St. John River, and it's in like the lakes and rivers going into it. I grew up in Keswick Ridge, which is west of Fredericton, basically on a tributary of the Wolastoq River, and I've got a cottage that's on a head pond, actually, that was made by the Mactaquac Dam as a result of that. But really, it's New Brunswick archaeology is kind of, it's been interesting for me just because it's the history of where I grew up, but it's also, it's interesting because it's a little bit like a sandbox in some ways, because it's a fairly small, it's a small part of a small region. There's a fairly active but small group of researchers in this region. And there's a lot of big questions that we can answer about Northeastern North America, but also about Indigenous history more generally in North America by using case studies from the region. And so I think there's lots of fascinating stories to tell, and there's so many that are left untold that I think it's kind of you can be a big fish in a small pond pretty easily here, basically. So.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that I know we've talked about this a lot, and so this is for the listener. What we're essentially doing is we're miking up conversations that Ken and I have pretty regularly, either this way or over drinks at conferences, or when we're at each other's house, or via text message, just with more typos, and maybe fewer emojis than you'd think. But so I think what sort of kept both of us in this region is that thing that you mentioned, which is that there's all sorts of big questions you can start to address with this really underutilized data set out here. And I think that's sort of why we're doing this podcast, right? Is that we want to explore some of those things. And at the end of this, are they called eps? I think they're called eps, right?
Yeah, episodes, yeah. It's a better format than like trying to snake through like a mile long text message conversation that's been going on for a long time. It's easier to get back to the conversation if we have something documented.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Yeah. No, it's good. I mean, and plus with like the screen fatigue, this way we can listen to it and we don't have to put on the like fancy blue glasses and stuff. So that'll be good. And then the other thing you mentioned that we should also mention is that I'm in the unceded territory of the Wabanaki, and that's the region we're going to be talking about. And so we'll have an episode talking about Indigenous archaeology and sort of the importance of considering Indigenous perspectives on archaeology in this region.
Yep, and I'm talking to you guys here today from the Treaty 7 territory, so the home of the Blackfoot, the Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda, Piikani, and Kainai, and Métis. Alberta Métis Region 3.
Yeah. And in addition to that, we're going to also talk about historical archaeology at some point. So the show will take a roughly, this season anyway, it will take a roughly sequential approach to some big questions in archaeology. And we're looking forward to that a lot.
Guide you along through 13,000 years of history.
Yeah, it's 13,000 years, 30 minutes at a time, something like that. And for those of you that are listening, you're going to get this special experience that talking about archaeology, if you're not watching this, if you're just listening to this, talking about archaeology is sort of like, it's like trying to describe a spiral staircase without using your hands. But we'll do our best to get you through it. So to get back to this idea of some big questions that we think the region can offer, what is it you're working on, Ken, for the listener?
So I've been working on a project as part of my dissertation, doing basically quarry sourcing work. So tracing stone tools back to their geological origin, essentially to try to map out social relationships and economic relationships among Wabanaki in the past. This research has been primarily focused on a source for stone on Washtenaw Lake in south central New Brunswick. So if you're thinking about the geography of New Brunswick, if you probably know where Grand Lake is, it's the next lake sort of down the river. And so in around Cambridge Narrows and that area of south central New Brunswick. And my work has involved some geoarchaeological work, so doing going out and collecting geological samples, recording archaeological sites, some limited excavation work, and trying to answer, basically questions about how people were interacting with one another, sort of building towards a larger narrative of rethinking the way that we think about how people were using and thinking about stones in the past, which has always been sort of framed in an economic framework of sort of talking about how groups would sort of probably pick the least cost path or the most optimal way of collecting and using rocks. And what I'm arguing is maybe that this had something maybe a bit more to do with a personal aesthetic preference, or maybe a ritual or social importance, and how by tracking a stone through time and its distribution, you might be able to tell a bigger story about that. And that research is sort of wrapping up as I finish up the last of my PhD work. We've had some interesting finds at a possible secondary quarry. I don't really know what it is yet, but I'm also working kind of on what the next thing is. And so maybe over the course of this podcast, I'll be able to talk about a little bit more about what the next project is. But I have an interest in lithics, basically, more generally, as a way to answer questions about how people were moving around the landscapes, the places that they were, and the people who they were interacting with. But I've also had the opportunity to work with Gabe, too, on a number of projects in his own research, too. So.
Yeah, and that's been a lot of fun. So I want to go back here a little bit just to this lithics thing. So that's what archaeologists call rocks. But I think the project you're working on kind of illustrates two interesting things that maybe you could explore a little bit. So from Indigenous perspectives, people have been in New Brunswick since time immemorial, but for archaeologists, we have evidence for about 13,000 years of human occupation here in New Brunswick or in the Northeast. And so how much time depth is there on your research? I think this is kind of interesting because I think one of the unique things that archaeologists have as a perspective on the past that other disciplines don't are we deal with these really big time swaths, right? And so, I always tell intro students that, sure, you take some class about, Canada since Confederation over in the history department, or you can take, some class in anthropology that's like ooze to tools, and so some really big perspective. But the stuff you're working on is maybe 13,000 years old, and not to sort of sneak preview this too much.
Yeah. So Washtenaw chert, or what appears to be Washtenaw chert, we don't know this for sure because there's with rocks, to be able to sort of conclusively say that they come from a particular place, you need to do geochemical analysis on them. And that hasn't happened with a lot of the archaeological resources or archaeological objects for a number of reasons, which I don't think really need to get into that nitty gritty of a detail. But there's an archaeological site in Nova Scotia, which is probably the oldest in the Maritimes, or at least in the Canadian Maritime provinces, at Debert, close to Truro. And I think it's like the average in the Lothrop article is like 12,600 is kind of what radiocarbon dates come out to.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
So the site is somewhere between probably 12,400 to 12,600 years old. And there is what appears to be Washtenaw chert associated with that. And that's kind of we see kind of a flash of use of Washtenaw chert at Debert, in South Nova Scotia, and a couple of places in around New Brunswick that indicate probably it was being used between about 12,500 years ago up to probably around 10,000 years ago. And then stops for about 6,000 years or so. And for why, we don't really know. But I suspect some of it has to do with the changing landscape that ancestral Wabanaki were living in. So you have changing water levels, maybe access to the source was different, or maybe they were going to a different source during the Palaeoindian period. So this older time period, about 12,500 years ago. And then the source at Bellier's Cove on Washtenaw Lake maybe became accessible, or would have become accessible sometime around 3,800 to 4,000 years ago. And maybe that's why people started using it again. So
we've got this time depth, I think, of what we're going to talk about in this program. But then I think one of the other things that we're going to stress, and because I know this is like an interest of both of ours, is just the connections between New Brunswick and the rest of the world, right? Which are really, really interesting, actually. And so one of the things we know, right, is that maybe at between 12 and 13,000 years ago, the folks that are living here seem to show remarkable technological similarities with people all over North America, right? They're using similar tools. And so that's a really profound connection between, what you and I describe often as the far northeast, right? This idea that's this place that's really far away from everything else. It's as far north, almost as far northeast as you can get, without, I don't know, Portugal or something. Yeah. But what's the furthest away you found this material from, or found evidence or heard about evidence of this material that's from Cambridge Narrows?
So it's potentially getting as far away as New York State, which is kind of cool. And so we know that exchange networks during the Paleoindian period, so this group of people who lived in the Maritimes, probably from about 12,900 years ago to about 9,500 years ago? Is that where we kind of settled the end of the Paleoindian period now?
Or 9,000.
So they were exchanging stone tools over a fairly large area, and were able to kind of figure out where people might have been going, or who they might have been interacting with, just based on distinctive types of stone that are found at these sites all around. And often in Paleoindian sites throughout the region, you're finding stone that's been traveling that has traveled either with people or been exchanged over a distance of several hundred kilometers. And in the case of this potential point, diagnostic point, or very characteristic style of arrowhead that's found in New York State, it appears to be this material from South Central New Brunswick, which is fascinating, because it shows that there's connections over a fairly broad area, which we know exist at other sites, but it ties people to a place in New Brunswick as well, which we don't actually know as well during that Paleoindian period.
Yeah, that's great. So I sort of love that, because that means that one point like overturns the two big myths, right, about New Brunswick archaeology, right? That people haven't been here that long, and that it's this sort of, place that's literally and figuratively provincial, right? It's this place where there aren't these big connections, but in fact, there's these really huge connections.
Yeah. And it's funny, because we talk about the Maritime Peninsula, and it was even more of a peninsula back then.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. Yeah. So what Ken's talking about the Maritime Peninsula is basically the eastern Wabanaki homeland. So in 1955, this guy named Bernard Hoffman wrote a dissertation out of Berkeley about the Maritime Peninsula. I think is that the first reference to it? It's the first.
I think so. Yeah.
And that's basically, Maine past basically Biddeford, and not counting Western Maine, and then it includes the Maritime provinces and then the Gaspé region of Quebec. And so that in some ways represents this kind of interesting, unified cultural place. I mean, and I think maybe that idea of homeland is pretty profound, going even back into the past.
Yeah, and if you think about this time period, you're talking about a group of people who have a shared technology, Clovis, so we call these distinctive arrowheads Clovis, And although there were humans in North America prior to Clovis, it's sort of this first like kind of cultural tradition that spreads across all of North America, and rapidly too. Like, within people are in the Maritimes within about 500 years of us seeing them in like the southwest of the United States, kind of thing. Sort of, these are, as you said, intrepid explorers that are kind of making their way to what would effectively be the end of the world at that time. Like you're sort of marching eastward as far as you can go.
Yeah, and at rates faster than pretty much any hunter-gatherer analog that we know of, right? This massively fast colonization event that links the whole continent. I agree. It's super cool. So we're teasing stuff, I guess, now that we're going to talk about a little bit, but I think it's kind of useful to think about both that big time depth and that big, just the kind of regions that we're tapped into. So, but what we probably should have done already is say, because we're trying to pitch this to a bit of a general audience, I think, what is archaeology? And I'm going to interrupt Ken here a little bit, because the way I like to think about this is, so very first archaeology class I took was at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And the teacher who was teaching that course had, and this is funny, you mentioned people before Clovis. He had been the teaching assistant at Meadowcroft, which is a purported pre-Clovis site. He's actually the guy apparently who found the piece of charcoal that returned the really old date. This guy named David Clark. And David Clark, my understanding was this old kind of battle-hardened Marine. And he, I don't know if the listener is familiar with the Pittsburgh accent, and I can't really do it, but I often had a really hard time understanding what he was saying. And he, you get in there, and this guy, he says, archaeology is the study of the human past. But I misheard, and I thought he said the human path. But I've kind of stuck with that, because that actually makes a little more sense than archaeology being the study of the human past. It was a good class, by the way, so I learned a lot. But but it's kind of that idea that as humans are sort of moving through the world, they're kind of creating this path, right? And just like any other path, it's limited. You can only tell so much about whatever was there before. But you pick up these little fragments, and you're sort of going around behind, getting a really limited, a tiny percentage of the kind of things people leave behind, and trying to infer what they did and how they lived their lives, and trying to impart degrees of humanity onto them. And so what would you add to that definition of archaeology, Ken? I know you're teaching intro. I'm blessedly on sabbatical right now, so you're more.
I don't actually teach intro. I teach intro. Okay. I get them in their third year, so they already know what archaeology is, or should. Not all of them do, I don't think. I'm not sure they all do, but I like the idea of path, and I think it's like a dendritic path too. It's like it's going off in many different directions, and some of it is trodden a little bit more than other paths, and so you can tell a little bit more about certain paths, and then some of them just sort of trail off into the woods, and you lose that thread, right? But certainly, it's like I like to describe it as it's like a big puzzle that you're missing a bunch of pieces to. And so, you don't always get, but if you stand back far enough, you can see sort of what the picture is supposed to be. But then when you look in at it, you see that there's all these pieces missing, or maybe one of those photos that's made up of all the different photos. And you can see what it's made of. But that's kind of the art book description of it. But certainly I think it is importantly, it's about telling histories and stories about the past that don't speak for themselves through text and things like that. That it's an interpretation of the past, and it is about, and I think it is important that stories are included in that, and that it's not just cut and dry data. There is, an archaeologist is telling one interpretation of a past, and I think that that's what makes archaeology interesting, is that you have a number of different people looking at sometimes the same things and coming up with different ways to describe it and help other people understand what was going on, in the last 13,000 years.
Yeah, and you and I are both. I mean, certainly, all your degrees are in anthropology, right? I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and mine are too, and that's an interesting thing about North American archaeology is that we take an anthropological perspective. So what does that mean? It means that anthropology is the study of humans, right? And that's really, really broad, but in practice, it's got all sorts of problematic colonial baggage and that kind of thing, but it involves, the sort of things I think that people think about when they think about anthropologists, questions of social organization, questions of humans interacting with one another, and historically an emphasis on non-Western groups of people. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yep. Yeah. And to add to archaeology too, like it's within anthropology, but we have archaeology is a very material culture based discipline, right? So it's tactile. It's often like what we're dealing with are the things of the past and, the material remains of the past, basically.
Yeah. So, arrowheads, which archaeologists call projectile points to alienate people, spear points, ceramics, right up till the present, right? People who study
or house floors like you do.
House floors, yeah. So I'm a house floor person.
We'll get back to you because we haven't had a chance to talk about what your wheelhouse is.
Yeah, we'll loop back. Yeah, So and I think that's one of that's what we're going to try to talk about in this podcast, essentially, right? Yeah. So it's funny, actually, you mentioned house floors, right? So Ken said I work on house floors, and house floors are maybe more, they really, really closely resemble a human path. In the instance that I've worked on, mostly Wabanaki house floors within the last 3,000 years, which are interesting for a whole bunch of reasons we'll talk about at a particular later episode. But they're what archaeologists call features, and features are just immovable artifacts. So, an artifact that you can't, or at least you shouldn't, huck out of the ground and just try to take back to the lab in a bag to study. So you dig them. Ken and I have dug some very cool ones together. Actually, we've had a lot of fun
in interesting ways.
Yeah, yeah. Part of what draws me or keeps me excited about archaeology, I think, is actually kind of encompassed in how you think about a house floor, which is there are these really interesting places where pretty much all members of a society come together, right? Because what is that? Pretty much everyone does. Everyone pretty much sleeps indoors. It's a very human thing. What do? Families come together around hearths and interact with one another. And you can learn a lot about trying to piece together those interactions based on how people live together. And I think one of the other exciting things about humanity is, so Ken, and I hope this is something we kind of impart to the listener. I mean, I think we're both generalists in a sense, but I think your research highlights the really big picture interactions that people have, right, over huge swaths of area. How are people in New Brunswick, even meeting people in New York, right, let alone interacting with them enough to exchange chert, and maybe through intermediaries, or maybe directly going there. We'll talk more about that later in the season, I guess it's called. And whereas a house floor is a much more personal, kind of connected place where people who really, really know each other well are interacting on a daily basis, right? So we've got all these different scales, and we know that we don't see the actual stains in the ground for the house floors that are almost 13,000 years ago, but we do see clusters of artifacts that indicate, where people built their tents, and we see within some of those clusters of artifacts really good evidence for how people actually structured their society, maybe according to gender, maybe according to people's relative rank within society. And there's this great quote from Barry Dana. I read it in the Bangor Daily News years ago, and he was building, and he was a important Penobscot chief and intellectual, I think would be fair to say. And they were building these wigwams as a sort of display at the Hudson Museum in Orono, Maine. And he described them as a teaching tool from the ancestors. And I thought that was really like a nice kind of continuity, right? Bring this 13,000 years ago right up to the present, right? So you and I both take this kind of, we're pretty continuity oriented, I think, in our views of basically connections between the really deep past and contemporary Indigenous people. And so one of the things that, we're both in writing arguing this, so this is not going to be a surprise to anyone, but that we tend to not be discontinuity. So in the bad old days, culture historians often thought that the way Indigenous cultures change is they have to basically move and be replaced and these kinds of things. And in fact, I think you and I would both argue that there's an awful lot of Indigenous endemic cultural change, in response probably to all sorts of things. But among those things are kind of historical precedent, historical stimulus, deciding to change for the reasons that other cultures decided to change, innovation, those sorts of things.
Yeah. Meeting, interacting with different people, finding a better way to do something is also a possibility. And also, and like living in a fairly dynamic environment too, and how that, the environment in the Maritimes changed dramatically. Even in the first few thousand years people were here, and that's going to change the places where you're going to live, or choose to live, and it may also mean that the places that you chose to live we can't find anymore because they're either underwater or scoured away by some geological process or some incursion of water, basically.
So we're losing coastline at a remarkable rate, and here, like around the world, people preferentially live on coastlines because they're really good places to live for a whole bunch of reasons: transport, food, good view. I suspect these aspects like good view are more important than we sometimes can interpret archaeologically.
Yep. Yeah. And it's the same argument that I have, that colorful rocks, I think, are probably, if we think it's beautiful, somebody in the past also did too, these gemstone quality rocks that people are using to make their stone tools with. I don't think, like, a lot of this has to do with the technical the technical ability of the person who's making the stone, but also that the stone can be made in this way. But there are lots of stones that can make very nice objects, and it seemed like frequently people in the Maritimes chose beautiful red and pink and yellow and white and clear rocks to make their stone tools out of. So
the listener should know that Ken actually can't see the color red, but he's told that these stones he works on are red. And in fact, so
I'm one of a few famous archaeologists in New Brunswick who there's a whole cadre of us that are colorblind.
Yeah, and I think in fact all New Brunswick archaeologists are colorblind. It's just the different. If you combine us, we can actually see all the colors, but I can't really distinguish blue, gray, and black. I discovered when I tried to buy a suit. And you can't distinguish red and green, and a lot of you can't distinguish, I think, red and green. I mean, no one working for Stantec could for a while, I recall. This is like an occupational requirement.
Yeah.
That's
why we're not all in the military.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I wanted to go back to something though. So you made a point about scale, which I think is really important, and I think that just when you're talking about the scales that we work at for, in each of our research projects, but I think when we're talking about archaeology more generally, scale, at the very small scale, what Gabe is talking about, you're looking at people gathered around a small campfire, and the scales that I'm working at, where I'm looking at these regions, the scale that Gabe works at factors into the sorts of things that I'm looking at as well. And so when we're trying to build these kind of, I want to get towards a story that Gabe's able to tell about a house floor in coastal Nova Scotia, and looking at the patterning of people sitting around a fire, making tools and cooking food, and, breaking apart caribou bones during the winter. And that's a really interesting story. And I want to be able to tell that story. And so in the bigger pictures that I'm talking about, I'm bringing in various different scales of data. And so I'm talking about, in some cases, these very contained spaces within somebody's house. Sometimes I'm talking about a whole site, which is another scale. Sometimes I'm talking about within a region, which is another scale. And then when we're talking about extra regional, so we're talking about people traveling like much farther distances. And so we kind of zoom in and out on these scales for different levels of inference, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make. And I think that one of the things that just as you're making that point, I was thinking about, we should mention that you're in a geography department now, or it's a geography archaeology department. Am I correct?
Geography and environment, but we're the
geography and environment.
Yeah.
Okay, right. But you do a fair bit of spatial work on considering about applying kind of GIS, geographic information system tools to things. And so one of the ways that we actually get at these kinds of different scales is via interdisciplinarity, right? So one of the things that's really, really fun about being an archaeologist, and when we were talking about this at the beginning, why do you actually do archaeology? One of the reasons that I do archaeology, and I think this is the same for you because I know we've had these discussions, is you get to like call up interesting people and ask them about things that you don't really know very much about, so you can, call a geologist sometimes and be like, hey, could you please explain this rock to me? Or, I would like to know more about these kinds of coastal processes.
How old is this till?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I also want to just briefly loop back to something Ken in Characteristic Modesty was talking about color, and Ken had a paper in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology. What year was it, Ken? Was it 2021?
2020. Yeah.
2020.
Late 2020. So.
Well, that's why we lost track of it, undoubtedly, because we were all. I was hiding under a desk in West Virginia, curled up with a pepperoni roll and a bottle of Fireball at the time.
Yeah. I had escaped to New Brunswick for a few months, but I was back in Toronto, living the dream in lockdown there.
Yeah, I was having a great time compared to you. But what your work showed, and I think this is really interesting because it's a very kind of humanizing thing, and I should let you explain it, except that sometimes when I let you explain this, you go on for too long. But basically showed that people were doing all sorts of stuff to rocks that were not increasing the kind of ability to make them into tools, but was changing their color into a more preferable color. Is that a fair summary? Yeah.
And they were selecting particular, when they were working and making stone tools, they were getting rid of particular colors at one stage of the point of the process of making a tool, and making tools out of a different color of this rock. So this washed and woke chert that I talked about at the start comes in a whole range of colors, from blue, purple to black to red, translucent gray, yellows, all this stuff. And the reds and the yellows and the translucent stuff appears to be more popular through time, or gets to be more popular. And what we can see in the way that people are making their stone tools is they reduce a large rock that you find on the beach down to a stone tool that we would find in an archaeological site. We see patterning that seems to indicate that the kind of blue-gray and the blacks and those rocks get kind of cast aside in order to get towards making a tool that is red. It seems like is the most common.
Fantastic. And this is, this segues into a segment that we're going to do each. So our plan is, I guess we'll key in the listener, but without incurring any obligations. We're going to try to make this a fortnightly podcast.
Yep.
And the fortnightly podcast will take the approximate form of what we've just done, except it'll be more focused because we'll be talking about something specific. So I think next 2 weeks, so the week after next, and we're not sure when we're airing this yet either. So that's why we haven't told you what day it is.
It could be next week. It could be tomorrow.
Yeah, could be 2023 though.
Maybe you bank them all together and you just sort of binge the whole podcast.
That's a great idea. That's save this up for a road trip.
Yep.
We could just drop it as a box set. We'll mail you CDs.
Yeah, DVDs. So you get the video with it.
Yeah, or laser discs even.
Yeah.
I mean, if that would be an option. Coming live on Betamax. It's the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. We're also, feel free to write us with better names for this. We're happy to have that.
My wife has given us a couple of suggestions, and you can vote in the comments below here Let me just pull these up here. Well, you keep going, Gabe. I'll pull up our suggestions for today.
I was just thinking that's very. My wife's suggestion was that maybe the world has had enough of listening to Ken and Gabe talk about archaeology just from us talking too loudly in restaurants and bars. And that we should, so I think it's great, fantastic. But one of the segments we're going to do in each episode, while Ken pulls that up, is we're going to call it hit pieces. And what we're going to try to do is these hit pieces. Each hit piece will be we'll be try to keep you up on the recent research from the region, and this is also supposed to keep us honest about making sure we stay up on the literature.
Yeah.
And one of the hit pieces we wanted to bring up is actually thinking about the kinds of issues Ken was thinking about in his paper on stone tool color, particularly the color red. Basically that paper that you did, Ken, is sort of the last 3,000 years. Would that be a fair?
Yeah, kind of, and really actually, brings in data from the last 3,000 years, but a real focus on the period from about 1,500 years till sort of European contact-ish, or a little bit later. Yeah, so late woodland period, basically maritime woodland.
Fantastic, and that was I was a part of that field research. It's live in the United States for most of my life, and the only time I get threatened with a gun is out doing field research at Washtenamock Lake with Ken Holyoke. But we'll bring that up at a later podcast. That's, I think, in the biz, that's a teaser. But is this article recently on SSRN, and we'll create show notes so you can find the links to this. SSRN is, I believe, a preprint service that posts articles that will soon be published or are going to be published somewhere at some point, by Nathaniel Kitchell, who's at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. I believe he's a postdoc there. Acquaintance of ours, nice fellow, and he has this paper up, Color as a Key Characteristic in the Terminal Pleistocene Fluted Point Period Lithic Economy in Northeastern North America. So that's referring to these early colonizing events, the first archaeologically known indigenous people in the region. We're also selecting for color, this kind of thing that Ken's talking about, even more recent. So, and it's the color red, which is really cool. Nathaniel in this paper is looking at Munsungin Lake, which is up in far northern Maine. I actually spent 2 days out with him there this summer. It's 50 miles. That's 1,000 kilometers past cell service. One of those operations. Pretty relaxing, actually. It's nice. It's good. And then we've got a couple of other hit pieces, I believe, Ken.
We've got this isn't from our region, but it's kind of an interesting new finding in human origins research, which is we're talking a lot about early people this week, even though I think next week is also, or the next episode is specifically about Palaeoindians.
No, next week is specifically the history of archaeology in New Brunswick.
Oh, okay. All right. There you go.
Yeah. But the listener can listen to them in whatever order they want, provided they give us enough fortnights to complete them. That's the trick.
So there's a new finding. So there's we've talked a little bit about pre-Clovis. So Clovis, we talked about, is a kind of the first sort of continent-wide cultural manifestation that we see, that there's a lot of continuities from people in the southwest of the United States all the way up into Truro, Nova Scotia, basically share a particular type of spearhead that we call Clovis. I don't know, can we figure out some way to put like an animation where we can show projectile point, like on the...
Yeah, we should try to do that. Well, what we should do is we'll link, when we do the Palaeoindian episode, what we could do is we can link the Bradley et al. Article from AE&A.
Yeah, or share the screen so we can at least see the listeners can see what we're talking about. In any case, prior to the first occupants of North America, what we kind of gloss as pre-Clovis, and a lot of these sites are kind of like a scattering of artifacts that are clearly human manufactured, but some of them have spearheads or small bifaces, so stones that have been basically made into a projectile of some kind. But a lot of them are just kind of an amalgam of a lot of flake tools. So kind of in the process of making a stone tool, you're just sort of breaking off sharp pieces, maybe using them as cutting tools, that kind of thing. The site Cooper's Ferry, which is in northwest Idaho, I think, And if like I thought Idaho was like in the Great Lakes region, and then I look at a map of America and it's like almost on the West Coast. But basically it's just
never figure out where Alberta is either, if this cheers you up. I always get Alberta and Saskatchewan, confused, and
but,
who knows.
So where this is basically not too far south of where I am, in Alberta.
Yeah, at the right area. Yeah,
basically. So
Alberta is northern Montana, is that right?
Yes, yeah. And so and I think this is south of Montana, isn't it?
Yeah,
geography wise.
I mean, everything's south of Montana.
There you go.
Yeah.
And so this site was found several years ago, and has a Clovis component to it, and has some occupations dating to upwards of, I think, around 9,000 years ago. But the most recent information that has come out, they thought that there was probably a pre-Clovis component there. What's interesting about this new finding is that they've recovered projectile points of a type that is not Clovis, that appear to be the date to somewhere between 15,000 and 16,000 years ago, which makes it one of the oldest pre-Clovis sites that is reliably dated, and is one of the only contexts where sort of a series of projectile points has been found. Stemmed projectile points is the other key part there. So these look like they were probably hafted onto some kind of spear or something like that.
What's hafted mean?
Hafted is when you basically take a stick, so your spear shaft, and you take a projectile point, so the rock that you've made, and you place the rock in either a split at the top of that stick or another stick that goes into that one called a foreshaft. You wrap it in sinew or some other binding, and it's adhered there, and that way the projectile travels either with the spear or on the what's the word I'm looking for? Foreshaft. You can throw that spear at an animal and take them down with it, basically.
Right. Yeah.
And then recover your projectile point that you spent all that time making from them.
Yeah. So it's the shaft of an arrow or the shaft of a spear. It's the connecting part.
Yeah, and just kind of interesting because it's very early and it's among one of the few contexts of what appear to be stemmed points, and they look characteristic of what has been called the Western stemmed tradition, that they thought probably was coeval with Clovis for a long time, but maybe it's a little bit earlier, and it may demonstrate either connections with Clovis at a later point, or that there was some kind of earlier colonizing population that was either had some kind of interaction with Clovis, or that they occupied the same areas, and the folks that made Clovis points either won out the day, or that technology became the vogue of the day.
Or in a year, we might find out that the dates at this Cooper site were totally banjaxed, and it's not as old as we thought.
That is also. I guess what makes this a little bit legit is like reading through it. These are from features, so like what Gabe talked about, these non-portable, and so these aren't just artifacts and like random chunks of charcoal that they're finding. They're finding what appear to be cultural features that are small pits that are probably some kind of fire pit, and the artifacts are coming from within those pits, which that gives you a little bit more reliable information. But yeah, a lot of this origin stuff is it's whiz bang and it's new every time, and then somebody raises a shaky finger about it. But
it's old every time. It's always old. Yeah.
But as I tell my students, like, I mean, even when I was an undergrad, pre-Clovis was still pretty kind of like, still hadn't kind of been widely accepted as that like this stuff is real. And I think it'd be pretty undeniable that pre-Clovis is real. It's just how many of these sites are legitimate and how old are they?
Yeah, there's a good article about this I'm going to do the thing where I say what the article is, but I actually can't remember, so we're just going to put in the show notes. But in the old Review of Archaeology, the late Brian Robinson had a good article kind of just setting the stage for the pre-Clovis argument, and sort of talking about the degree to which a pre-Clovis site is held as opposed to a Clovis site.
There's sort of three criteria that make them like sort of Paquetet and Sassman have like these three criteria, and one of them is like, it directly underlies a later component, like a later Clovis component. It's got to have stratigraphically intact.
Stratigraphy artifacts and dates, I think.
Yeah, and that the artifacts are very clearly made by humans.
Yeah. And that's where it all breaks. That's the one where a lot of, and you know, the colleague of ours, is a couple of colleagues of ours actually are still Clovis firsters, I believe. And I've been increasingly, I guess, sympathetic to some of these arguments. I found myself a little more sympathetic to the Clovis first position, I think, but some of it has been just that it does tend to be that one of these sites will be a little shaky on at least one of those criteria, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting, but we'll talk more about that. So what we should do is actually, no one wants to listen to us talk about pre-Clovis. We should get somebody on that deals with this. That's actually more interesting.
It would be.
Yeah. No, you and I could ramble on about this for ages. And we're not really Palaeoindian guys. Although I should say, not to toot my own horn. Yeah, I've published more on Palaeoindians than anyone else in New Brunswick.
The preeminent scholar on Palaeoindians in the
precisely
Maritimes.
Right. That's right. Yeah, I've written. I think the 6th author on a fairly long paper about Palaeoindians, and I was the 3rd author on a short paper about Palaeoindians. So that's right, folks. Feel free to email in with your questions about that topic, and Ken and I will endeavor to find
any of your pre-Clovis finds. We're the line to call.
Yeah, exactly.
Should we have a phone-in line for this show for like radio questions? You know,
we really should. We should do it like the old Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell. You know, west of the Rockies, you're on the air. You know, and and it'd be perfect. So we've got one other hit piece that I want to share, and this is really hot off the press. Accepted December 14th of just last year, and so it's just out in the most recent Journal of Archaeological Science, and it's by Dylan R. Kelly and his colleagues, mostly at the University of New Hampshire, where he or she also appears to be. And the article is called "Expanding Omnidirectional Geospatial Modeling for Archaeology, a Case Study of Dispersal in a New England Colonial Frontier Between 1600 and 1750." And so that appears to be applying GIS modeling to understanding the European spread throughout the region. And it looks really interesting. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So I think where Ken and I were going to sort of wrap up to whet your appetite here, because we are pretty much each looking at a half-finished bottle of Courvoisier at this juncture. Let's just go through a couple of what we think are some of the big questions that we're going to look at, and some of this idea is derived a little bit from our close colleague Matt Betts, and I worked on this book a while ago, and in that book we thought about what are sort of big questions in archaeology in the region, and that's derived from two big papers, one in Proceeding of National Academy of Science, one in American Antiquity, talking about big questions for archaeology in general, right? And a point that I think Matt and I wanted to make, and that Ken and I want to make now, is that we think New Brunswick archaeology is just as interesting, just as compelling, just as interesting, and an environment to approach these kinds of questions as really anywhere in the world. You know, that there's, you know, you could work anywhere you want, but this is, you know, the Northeast, far Northeast is as good a place as any, and probably a better place than most to get at a lot of different archaeological questions. And we were going to sort of just go through a couple ones that motivate us, I think. And so do you want to go first, Ken, about, you know, what you think, you know, what's some big question in the region that you think New Brunswick or the Maritimes can speak to?
I think it's really interesting to think about like the late woodland is kind of what I'm most familiar with. And so this is a period from, depending upon who you talk to, starts about 1,500 years ago to about 1,000 years ago. I think you guys fell on 1,300 years ago is sort of when the late woodland starts.
The Dave Black date, I think.
Yeah. So the period leading up to between about 1300 years ago and let's say 800 years ago. So leading up to and around 1,000 years ago, there's this kind of this watershed moment in a lot of North American archaeology, actually. And it's a time period when you have ancestral Wabanaki sort of intensifying their behaviors in terms of how much they're interacting with one another, how they're sort of getting their food, like subsistence resources and that kind of thing. But their neighbors are also now starting to grow corn. And so I think one of the big questions is, whether or not there was any kind of adoption of domesticates in the Maritimes, for one, but also if there wasn't, why? And I think that's a really interesting case study, because there's so few examples in North America of groups that sort of eschewed this move toward sedentary, domesticated, horticulture and agriculture in the period before European contact. So,
yeah, and the some of the listeners too may have recently read David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, which is called
The Dawn of Everything.
Dawn of Everything. Great, it's on your shelf. Fantastic.
Yeah.
And one of the things about that book is it's in many ways exactly about the question Ken just outlined, right? Which is, there are all of these things that we sort of thought we knew about how people's economies, how they make their livings, how they organize themselves socially, and how they move around the landscape, that are supposed to have these kind of causal effects. They're supposed to be these kind of packages. And it turns out that there's all sorts of cross-cultural evidence that doesn't work the way we kind of thought it did. And that's a topic that both of us have worked on a lot, actually. That's sort of, it's kind of in our wheelhouse. So
I'm going to send it back to you. And I hope you say this one that I want you to say, because I know you've been working on this topic for a while. You and Matt present. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, right. So, and that riffs on what you're talking about. And Matt and I have been working on this idea of complexity. And so complexity, which is actually kind of an unfortunate term for it, because it implies that the opposite is simplicity. But when an anthropologist says complexity, what they basically mean is like, how many moving parts does the socioeconomic organization of a group have? And so the premise is that sort of like at the one end of complexity, you have the hunter-gatherer band, which is like a small, probably kind of family group with really, really limited and actually really interesting, though, political leadership, which is extremely limited, right? So the actual like coercive power of a hunter-gatherer headman or whatever the cultural equivalent of a headman is like pretty much nil, right? It's like, offer some good advice, a couple of honorary privileges, and then kind of the opposite end, you imagine like states, right, where there's all sorts of coercive power. There's these big bureaucracies. If you're acting out, they'll put you in a hospital or an asylum or prison or kill you or something. And in between that, though, there are these other kinds of social organization. But for a long time, hunter-gatherers, with very, very few exceptions, and one of the classic exceptions was the Northwest coast of North America. But hunter-gatherers, that is people who didn't have domesticated plants and animals other than the dog, that they just didn't have political organization that extended beyond basically the family band. And so there was very little inequality within groups. There was very little connections among these bands that were actually forming larger political organization. And one of the things that Matt and I are just sort of working on is this idea that it seems like this ebbs and flows among hunter-gatherers. So people on the Maritime Peninsula, people in the Wabanaki homeland, were hunter-gatherers until after European contact, even though almost all hunter-gatherers know how to grow plants, right? They're so intimately involved with the natural world. There's no way they don't have some sense of how this could be done. They've got neighbors who are domesticating plants. That there seems to be a kind of conscious choice to just not do that, but to still have many of the things that you would expect to go along with that occur here. Give you one example. Bill Farley and Amy Fox and I looked at house floors, right? Come back to house floors. And at about the time period we're talking about, 1,300, 1,000 years ago, where supposedly maize proliferates in southern New England, although there's some debate about how important that is. Houses get bigger, which is exactly what you would expect to happen. But it turns out up here they get bigger too, not as in as pronounced of a way, but there still is that change. And so we did this comparative paper on that. So there's all sorts of interesting stuff going on, and hunter-gatherer culture change is a big question in the discipline right now. Trying to figure this all out. I probably rambled on a little bit about that, but I'm glad I selected the answer you were trying to set up there.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, Matt, when we say Matt, is Matthew Betts, who's the Atlantic Collections Coordinator at the Canadian Museum of History. And so he and Gabe recently in 2021 published the first comprehensive textbook on the region, the archaeology of the Atlantic Northeast, available through University of Toronto Press. No, not a sponsor yet, but
but we should add, I mean, since you've already done their social media in the past, I believe that, so thanks for the plug. It's great bedtime reading. And actually I should mention, just as long as we're moving product here, Ken and I also just had an edited volume out, which is it on your shelf? I think it's your laptop stand.
Hold on.
Mine's right here. Here, I've got.
I think mine's at my office, and actually, so is your textbook, because
this makes a fine laptop stand. This is the far northeast, 3,000 BP to contact. BP means before present, which kind of confusingly actually means before 1950. But what can you do?
Yeah.
And that this book actually deals with a lot of the issues that we just were describing. So, and it's got a lot of good work in this by a bunch of scholars. I can't remember how many authors do we have in there, but a lot.
17 chapters. And I think of those 17 chapters, there's only 3 or 4 that are single authored. So
so good number of people working on these kinds of questions. And both of those things are fun. So we're probably running long here, Ken. But can I I'll just kind of bullet point list some other, I think, big questions, and you can add some more if I miss any. The relationships between coastal people living on the coast, people living on the interior. What are their connections? What are their interactions? We know now that during the woodland period, there were people living on the coast year-round and people living on the interior year-round, right? So that might be another myth about New Brunswick archaeology that contradicts. Villages, which relates to the complexity question. When do we see the origins of these villages? How, so basically communities that are bigger than small camps. I think you alluded to this earlier, questions of just really, really long distance exchange. So what are the interactions between New Brunswick and the rest of North America?
How integrated was it through time, and the patterning that we're starting to see, that there's sort of these like flashes of interaction where there's sort of broader extra regional interaction, and then there's sort of this like kind of little bit more closing up, and then it comes and it spreads again. So
absolutely, yeah. And then there's some questions just of archaeological practice. So we actually certainly kind of hope that maybe among the listeners someday for this podcast, which we hope to grow, will include, some 15-year-old kid that would like to be an archaeologist, right? And so can get a sense of what that means, and also actually a sense that it's actually an achievable goal. So Ken and I are professors, which is actually a fairly niche profession for archaeologists. But we both worked in this thing called cultural resource management, which is actually projected to need more people than we're training to do the work. So
something like in the States alone over the next 10 years, there's going to be like literally hundreds of positions left unfilled. And talking to colleagues across Canada in the CRM industry, They're clamoring for work right now, for workers right now. And it's expected to continue at least for the next few years. So,
yeah. So one of the things that we kind of want to convey is to make this a kind of approachable discipline. But so within that, though, I think we can think about a couple of big questions for archaeological practice. And one of these is that you, New Brunswick taxpayer, are paying for an awful lot of archaeological research, which is done ahead of development. And so you might wonder, why do you not know more about that? That, I think, is in fact one of the big questions going forward, which is that why is there a lot of archaeological research going on or archaeological work going on that is not being appropriately translated to the public?
Yep.
Another question has to do with salvage. What are we doing about rising sea levels? How are we going to address this? And then finally, I think, and this is an enormous issue, dealing with collaborative archaeology. So going about archaeology in a way that is respectful and considerate of Indigenous views.
And what's the relationship between archaeologists and Indigenous communities? What's the relationship between those communities and governments? And how much involvement is there in terms of like regulatory control over how archaeology is done, both like research work and CRM work? Where are objects stored? Who has access to them? And these are all like evolving and very active, very forefront topics in North American archaeology, I think specifically in Canadian archaeology. And as Gabe mentioned at the top of the show, we're talking about New Brunswick, which is in unceded territory. And we're talking about archaeology and Indigenous sovereignty as it relates to archaeology at a time where nations are probably moving toward comprehensive land claims in the region, some of which have been publicized so far, and some of which are probably going to be publicized in the future.
And which may draw on archaeological data as well. So,
yeah.
So considering the importance of that moving forward. So Ken, I think we've done the thing where we got excited about this, and we've talked for a while, and I see here in my notes I'd put 30 minutes. I think we've done a little bit longer, but we can warn the listener, that they can listen to us they can listen to you at 1.5 speed. That's actually 2 speed for me because I'm from New England. But you've got that. You're developing that Alberta drawl. So
yeah. They didn't give me my cowboy hat yet, though.
Well, they don't give it to you. They're earned, I'm told.
Yeah.
They but I'm excited. I got to get out there sometime so we can go to that pawn shop you showed me the picture of that just had like saddles.
Yep.
Yeah. That's terrific.
Tack shop. It's got a cowboy boot shop right beside it too, actually.
That's what I actually need. Yeah. I'll be about 5'7" in those. Yeah. All right, gentle listener. This was fun. We'll see you in 1 fortnight.
Yep.
And I'm Gabe Reinick, and my co-host is Ken Holyoke. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your 2 weeks, and we'll see you again soon.
See you next time on either Too Sharp Travels or Talking Through Screens, or perhaps even the Aperture Report.
Oh, that's that. And feel free to write in. I mean, we'll take other suggestions. We'll put our contact information in the show notes. It's the same contact information you can use to send us pictures of funny shaped rocks. So we will see you soon, or we won't see you soon because it's a podcast, but we will talk to you soon. Take care.